What if there are some evils we just can't explain? Is that evidence that God doesn't exist, or is it evidence that we just don't know enough? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. So far, we've been considering the logical problem of evil, and it goes something like this. If God exists, he could prevent evil because he's all-knowing and all-powerful. If God exists, he would prevent evil because he's all good. So if God exists, then evil does not exist. But evil exists, therefore God does not exist. We've also considered some possible counterexamples to premise 2, and those were reasons that God might have to allow evil in the world. So, for example, let's take the evil that it is evil for arsonists to burn somebody's house down. It's a bad thing to happen. And yet, we could say possibly that a reason that God allows that is because there's the good of free will. It's good for arsonists to have the free will decision to use, their choice for good things or for evil things, even if they don't happen to use it. It's good that they had the free will in the first place. But then we could change it around a little bit and say, well, what about wildfires? Change the evil to, it's evil for wildfires to burn down somebody's house, and no longer do we have the free will defense. But then again, remember, we had the character building defense. Possibly it's the case that it's good for that house to burn down because although the owner will have to go through some trials and tribulations trying to claw their way back, it tends to be the case that when bad things happen to us, we become stronger for it, or we become more empathetic for it, or something like that. So possibly that's why God might allow that evil. But then we could change it so that defense doesn't work. And we could say, what if instead of saying that wildfires burn down just somebody's house, wildfires burn down Perfect Patty's house. Let's say Perfect Patty is a person that has perfect moral character, doesn't need to be strengthened in mind and strengthened in heart, doesn't need anything like that. I know it's pretty unlikely, but let's just say for the sake of this example. What about that? The character building defense no longer exists here. Well, possibly we could give the love defense. Maybe it's good for Perfect Patty's house to burn down because all her neighbors will come around and encourage her and help her to rebuild and basically to love on her. And it's good for her to be able to receive that love. But then again, we could change that possibility and say, what if we had the evil of wildfires burning down Perfect Patty's house who lives in Isolationville, right? Population 1, just her, and nobody lives for 100 miles around. And now all of a sudden we no longer have the love defense. Now we could say, there's nobody to come around and to help Perfect Patty. Nobody knows her. It's just Perfect Patty all by herself. So we no longer have the love defense. Well, we could give the megaphone defense. And the megaphone defense was, evil might happen to Perfect Patty because it refocuses her from the good things that she has that won't totally make her happy. The temporary happiness, the partial happiness that'll never truly satisfy you, like, I don't know, the wildlife that she enjoys or the solitude that she likes, and refocus her vision onto the only thing that can truly make her happy, which in this case would be God, the only thing that is infinitely good and infinitely wonderful and all those kinds of things. But one more time, we could change this and say, what if it was Saint Perfect Patty, who had her house burnt down by wildfires, and it was in the middle of Isolationville? So now Saint Perfect Patty spends all of her days contemplating God and knitting sweater vests for the homeless. I don't know, something good, right? And now all of a sudden, it's not the case that this perfectly moral, perfectly, theologically focused person has all these defenses. What do? Those were the only defenses we really considered. Well, one thing we could do, of course, is to go out and look for an additional defense, an additional reason why God might allow that specific kind of evil. And yet, it kind of sounds like we're going to get into some kind of arms race here, where an atheist comes up with some new wacky, possibility of an evil, and the theist comes up with some new wacky possible reason why God would allow that evil, and we're just going to keep going back and forth, and we're going to get nowhere. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that it shows a possible shortcoming that we could have in this strategy of finding these counterexamples. And it's this. We are assuming for premise 2 something like the statement that God doesn't have any good reason for allowing evil in this world, Now, we could read that in one of two ways. That could mean that God doesn't have any reason for allowing any evil in this world, and in which case our counterexamples would be sufficient to reject that. But we could also read it as God doesn't have any reason to allow every evil in this world, every single one, right? And in that case, our counterexample is going to have to work for every single possible evil here, and we see, we can get wackier and wackier. Now, possibly it's the case that our four counterexamples can actually handle any single wacky evil that you could come up with. It might even be the case that, the Saint Perfect Patty that's living in Isolationville, I don't know, there might be some way that we can use these or reject that as a possible evil. But let's find out. Let's take a closer look at this kind of problem of evil. We're moving a little bit away from the logical problem of evil. Or I should say we're adapting it. We'll call this the logical problem of a specific evil. And the argument goes something like this. If God exists, then no irredeemable evil exists. And this is sort of a combination of proposition 3 from the original problem with the insight that, sure, there are some possible reasons that God might have for allowing some evils. There are some possibly redeemable evils. By redeemable, I mean that, you can bring some kind of good from that evil that makes it worth it. And maybe it's the case that each evil has to have a specific reason for being, or maybe it's the case that each evil just has to be part of a larger picture of a redeemable story. Whatever it has to be, then we'll say a redeemable evil can fit that bill. An irredeemable evil is one that can't. One that you can't bring a good from that is worth it, that nobody could, including God in this case. Now say that X is an evil, and that no one has discovered a redeemable explanation for X. And of course, we're assuming that we spent sufficient time and looked at all the different details that we needed to look at. And X could be any particular evil we can think of. In this case, we're looking at Saint Perfect Patty having her house burnt down by a wildfire in Isolationville. And this premise would be identical to proposition 4 in the original argument, only I'm using that variable X to stand in for every single possible evil that we can put into there. So now we're accounting for every single evil, not just any evil in general. And the next premise is the interesting one, and it's become to be called the Noseeum Inference. So it goes something like this. If that's the case, if it's the case that X is an evil and no one has discovered a redeemable explanation for X, then there is no redeemable explanation for X. Then X is an irredeemable evil. And it's called the Noseeum Inference because obviously if you don't see them, then they can't be there. That's the inference, right? That we have to be able to see it in order for it to actually exist. And from there, the rest of the argument follows easily. So X is an irredeemable evil from 7 and 8. So there is an irredeemable evil from 9, and therefore God can exist from 6 and 10. Now, one possible response we can give to this is an argument from induction. An argument from induction, inductive reasoning goes something like this. And if you know this already, I know this is an old hat example. I apologize. Everybody uses this, but it's going from a specific instances to a general conclusion. So for example, I see one swan that's white, I see another swan that's white, swan number 3 is white, and so on and so forth. And then I will make the general conclusion, all swans must be white. And in the same, this is very similar to the argument from induction for our ability to trust in science. Science has explained this one thing here that we didn't think was explainable. It has explained this other thing, it explained this other thing. Therefore, science can explain everything. And we can use a similar argument from induction to support the idea that we can find a redeemable explanation for any evil. So we found a redeemable explanation for this evil, a redeemable explanation for that evil, so on and so forth until we get to this one. And we don't have one yet, but from induction, I'm going to generally conclude that we will find one. And yet the problem with this is that argument from induction is notoriously weak. So for example, think about that argument for the idea that all swans are white. Why think that has to be the case? Why couldn't we have a black swan? What is it in the nature of a swan that makes it so that it has to be white? Or it could be black or purple for all I know. And in the same way, what makes it the case that our methods and our abilities are such that we have to be able to discover every single possibility and explain every single thing out there. Surely it's the case that there could be some particle that's so small that we would never build an apparatus that could observe it, and it acts in such a way that we'd never be able to deduce, exactly the way it is. So what, right? I mean, it seems like that's possible. And in the same way, it seems possible that there would be some evils that we just wouldn't have the ability to discover the redemptive value of. And then again, that gives us the possibility of a different response to this objection. That would be skeptical theism. So the Noseeum inference is only justifiable if X is what I'll call a transparent evil. Now, by the way, I should make a note here. A lot of philosophers use the term inscrutable that work in skeptical theism, inscrutable evils. And to my mind, things are a little bit confused with the way they're using that term. And I wanted to use that term here to, have the same kind of vocabulary, but I think it'd probably be better if I just use a different term. So I'm using the word transparent. And by transparent, I don't mean obvious. Now, there are some evils that we have obvious redemptive value for. So the most obvious one for me would be like those, things that you really want to happen, they don't end up happening. And then you're like, I had a girlfriend once that was awful human being. And my buddy Stucky even told me, she sucks. And I remember thinking, wow, my friend is willing to tell me that, that's a true friend, right? He's willing to let me know. And I think she broke up with me. I can't really remember what happened, but I remember I was really upset and it hurt a whole bunch. And then I met my wife and, it was awesome. I remember thinking like, oh, that's why that didn't work out, right? Like God was setting this whole thing up for this one special person. And I'm not saying that that's always the way it goes down, but at least you could see how like in this specific situation, that was a redemptive reason for that evil. I'm glad that happened. But it's not always the case. It could be the case that it's a lot harder to see the redemptive value of the evil and it takes a long time. So for example, when I got out of the Air Force, I really wanted to teach philosophy at the university level. And it ended up, I had to scrap it out for like 11 years in teaching high school philosophy. And I was mad at God sometimes, like, why am I here? You know what I want to do. There's these things that I want to accomplish and all those kinds of things. And I didn't understand why for 11 years. But when I look back on it now, I'm like, wow. First of all, I love those kids. It was so fun. And if some of my students hopefully are watching this now, and if you are, love you guys. That was so much fun. But also what I really liked about it, and one thing, looking back on it, the redemptive value there was that high schoolers let you get away with zero. They won't let you BS your way through anything. And a lot of times for philosophers, when we don't have amazing reasons, we can tend to just intimidate. We can tend to sort of bully people with big words. And high school students shut down immediately. They're not impressed by the big words. You need to come correct, right? And it really helped me in my philosophy to make things understandable and to get rid of things that were just BS. And so I look back after 11 years and I see, there was some kind of redemptive value. At the time, though, it wasn't that way. So there are these evils that it takes a long time to discover the redemptive value for. Those would still be transparent evils because we have the ability to discover the redemptive value. But there also could be other evils that we don't have the ability to discover their redemptive value. And we'll call those opaque evils. The main claim for a skeptical theist is this, that if we consider an evil and we can't find any redemptive property possible for it, then that evil is not an irredeemable evil, but instead an opaque evil, an evil for which we just can't find the redemptive property. It's there, but we just can't discover it. Now, of course, that is the proposition we're going to have to argue for, and we'll do that in a second here. But notice that if that's the case, then the Noseeum inference is unjustified. There's no reason to believe it. And since the Noseeum inference is crucial to this problem of a specific evil, then the problem of a specific evil is also unjustified. So it's still the case that if God exists, then an irredeemable cannot exist. But really, the thrust of the argument here is that just because an evil doesn't seem to have some kind of redemptive property to it doesn't mean that there isn't one. It might be just a lack of ability on our part. So why think that this might be the case? Well, skeptical theists give a number of reasons. The first of which being the difference between an infinite God and a finite man. And I guess I'm changing this up a lot. I'm really going to lean a lot on the nature of God versus the nature of man. And I don't know that a lot of skeptical theists do so. But here's the idea. God is an infinite being by hypothesis here, right? If what we're considering is the possibility of God existing, then what we mean by God is a being that is infinite in power and infinite in knowledge, right? So this being would have the ability to redeem whatever this being would want to redeem. And yet we are beings of finite power and finite knowledge. So we couldn't necessarily have the ability to redeem any possible evil, and we wouldn't know how to even if we could. So notice the difference here. There would be necessarily, if God would be an infinite being and we would be a finite being, there would necessarily, by the very nature of God versus the nature of humans, be redemptive properties that we would not be able to fathom, right? Redemptive properties that we couldn't even comprehend. There would also be redemptive properties that we would be able to comprehend, but we wouldn't be able to discover. Now, maybe it's the case that God only uses the latter. Maybe there's one day that we're all sitting in heaven and God says, okay, everybody, here's what happened, right? When you saw this evil, when you saw St. Perfect Patty's house get burned down, etc., really, here's what I was doing with that. And we say, oh, wow, okay, I get it now. Maybe it's not that idea would actually accord with the Judeo-Christian idea that, or I should say the Christian idea, because this is Paul in the New Testament, that one day we will know as we are now known, right? We will know perfectly as we are now known. It could be the case that God only uses those kinds of evils that we will eventually understand. And it could be the case that God uses some evils that we just couldn't understand. I don't know. But both kinds of evils would necessarily exist by nature of God, by the nature of an infinite being. Now, I should note that doesn't mean that God had to use opaque evils. It might be the case before creation, God said, no, I'm not going to use any of those. But instead, it would be the case that we're looking around now and we see these evils and we can't figure out the redemptive properties of them. And we say, oh, well, these must be those opaque. I know by the nature of God and by my limited nature, there must be these opaque evils. Another possible argument that skeptical theists give is the incompleteness of our moral intuition. So we have very strong moral intuitions about certain things. Certain things are good things and certain things are evil things. And yet, our moral intuitions have changed a lot over the centuries. Some would say in a cyclical way, some would say in a progressive way, some would say in a haphazard way. But we have very strong moral intuitions, and yet they've constantly changed over the years. And especially it's the case in the United States that they have changed drastically in a short period of time. Now, if that's the case, there's really no reason for us to believe that our moral intuitions are done changing. I mean, the things that we think are good right now, we might not think the same thing in the near future, and it would be pretty bold to think that we just have it perfect. Right now, the way everything is can't be wrong. So it might be the case that things that we can't determine the redemptive property of right now, sometime in the future, humans will look at it and be like, oh yeah, of course, now I see why that is. So we have incomplete moral intuitions. We shouldn't jump to the conclusion that the evils that we see that don't make any sense to us can't make any sense. And the final reason that I'll consider here for this main claim of skeptical theism is the complexity of the story, the complexity of the good-evil adjudications. So there's this metaphor that's sort of thrown around here, and now that I think about it, I don't really know what it's called. I don't know, maybe you've seen when people do this, like they have this wooden circle and they do some kind of stitching or embroidery or cross stitching. I don't really know. I think I had my grandma used to do, or some old lady that was possibly related to me, probably a great grandmother. I have memories of seeing her do it with maybe yarn, or I don't really remember exactly, but I remember looking at the back side of it and it was one hot mess. And I remember looking at the front side of it and it was an actual picture. And I won't say that it was a beautiful picture, but Possibly it's the case that the good-evil story here, we see these goods and we see these evils. Possibly it's the case that these things are so complex that we just can't make out what the bigger picture is fully. We can kind of look there and say, okay, I can see how a story is sort of unfolding here, and I see how it could be this attractiveness, but I don't get, why is that thread there? It might be the case that there are threads like that we just don't get because we can't see the full picture as we are right now. Maybe we'll never see the full picture. Maybe we'll see the full picture at some future time. I think what I'll do now is just give you a real world example that isn't, one of these Sing Perfect Patty kind of absurd things, or even isn't one of the little things that we have. So a few years back, a buddy of mine died. He was quadriplegic and lived a lot of his life in a lot of pain, left behind a wife and a son that's about my oldest son's age. And he led our Bible study. He was an amazing example of a father and of a husband, and very influential in a lot of our lives for the guys in the Bible study. Now, when I look back on that time, I definitely find some redemptive value to it. I look at it, I should say I'm speaking for myself, not for Patrick and his family. I wouldn't presume to do so, but I definitely, it affected me tremendously, and it was very hurtful for me to lose somebody that was so influential. And yet I know that I definitely have changed as a father, and have decided to spend more time with my kids and to focus on them, because I know that we have limited time. And I've definitely tried to do things that I thought were worthwhile, like starting this philosophy channel, because I thought, again, we could go at any time. It also made me appreciate, a guy like Patrick that would run the race so well, that would live his life at such an incredible way. And we could all see it finished early, and we can look at and say, like, wow, like, that's what I want to do. I want to live like that. I want to die like that. I want to be like, because we're all going to die, right? And I want to be able to finish strong, just like that guy. And yet, it's still confusing. I still look back and I remember being in that service, the funeral service, and just being dumbfounded. And still to this day, I wonder, like, what the heck was with that? How did Patrick leave? How is he gone? So I think the weird part about it is we don't have the faculties to, measure out the good and measure out the evil. And, we don't have the calculus to get from that kind of evaluation. Okay, we came up stronger on good than evil this time, Even in those cases where it's not so close, we look at it and we don't have the ability to really know, like, all the stuff that comes out of it. So what I'm saying is, and this is the argument that skeptical theists give, but I kind of agree with it, because I look at it and I think, maybe my powers of judgment here aren't quite as precise as are needed to really get an understanding of it. Maybe I just got to trust that, it is coming out that way, even though I can't see it. In any case, an objection that skeptical theists get is that, well, God, if he did exist, wouldn't allow for opaque evils. God would explain everything, or he would give it to us in a way that we would be able to get it. And an analogy that they give is like a good parent. They say a good parent would explain all the reasons why. Maybe they would allow bad things to happen to you. Maybe they would allow you to suffer in small ways, but they would explain why, right? They would give you those reasons. And so if God existed, he would be like a good parent if he were good, and he would explain those things, or at least have them understandable for us. He would not allow these opaque evils. And yet, I would say even that metaphor kind of fails the case here. I mean, if you think about a good parent, they don't always explain why they're allowing you to suffer whatever amount you suffer. So, for example, I know, like, when my kids were younger, they couldn't understand why they might be in timeout because they didn't share their toys. They didn't have the faculties to comprehend. And if I tried to explain it to them, things would just get worse. You're in timeout because you didn't share your toys, but I don't want to share my toys. Well, you're going to be an unhappy boy if you don't grow up sharing your things that I want to. That makes me happy. But my kids don't get that, selfish people are not happy people. They just aren't. It's the people that are living a life that are constantly giving to others. Those are the people that end up being happy. I mean, think about the people that you know that are really happy. Is it the greedy ones? Is it the people that are hoarding? No. I mean, eventually you're like, oh, I got all this stuff. Awesome. What do I do with it? But it's the people who are constantly, giving to others, not giving into others, but giving to others that are constantly having friends and being loved by people and loving others. Those are the happy people. So my kids couldn't really comprehend that. Sometimes I just got to be like, look, you share your toys or you're going to be in timeout. Why? Because dad said so. Because dad loves you. He knows better. And this is what's going to happen. And I think that's really what faith is when we come down to it. I think it's not like just assenting to a proposition. Yes, I believe that God exists. There's a passage in James that says, oh, you believe in God? Sweet. So does the devil. What does that get him? But instead, it's like saying, okay, I don't get it all, right? I don't understand why this evil thing is happening to me, but I know that God loves me. I know that God is good, and I know that he knows way better than me, so I'm going to trust him on this one. And then remember that it's not the case that we won't always understand it. Just like later on in life, I explained to my kids, so guys, here's why I was putting you in timeout. And they think, oh, of course, yeah, I didn't want to be a selfish jerk. Again, maybe one day we're all hanging out in heaven and God says, here's why all those things happen. And we think, oh, of course, yeah, now I get it. But back then it seemed like, awful and terrible, and we couldn't understand why you would do that, and we were mad at you. And that is what being a parent is, by the way. I do want to say one more thing here, and I want to say this is kind of weird because we're doing philosophy of religion, so it's sort of like philosophy and theology get all intermixed here. And sometimes the people who are giving certain objections are not the same kinds of people, or they start off with different assumptions. And so some responses will work for some people and not for other people. So one objection that a theist might give is that, no, God wouldn't allow these opaque evils. He would only allow these transparent evils because that's just, I don't really know why you'd say that. But if you're a Jew or a Christian giving that kind of an argument, I think the book of Job actually gives us a strong support for skeptical theism. And here's what I mean. So in the book of Job, Job loses everything. His kids are killed, all his property is gone, and he gets this awful disease, and his wife tells him to curse God and die. And we're told that Job is like Saint Perfect Patty here, right? Great guy everybody loves, super holy, does everything right, and yet loses all of his stuff. To make matters worse, his best friends cruise over to comfort him and instead end up just blaming him. Like, it's all your fault. You must have done something wrong, right? God doesn't let bad things happen to good people. So, and I think more to the point, I think they argue for the impossibility of opaque evils, saying that, yeah, you must know why God allowed these things to happen. You must, right? They're got to be obvious if you just look. At the end of the book, Job gets frustrated and finally says, I wish God were here because I would tell him this is not fair, right? I did everything you asked and this is not fair. And what's interesting about it is that God doesn't come down and say, oh, yes, it is fair. Here's reason one, here's reason two. But instead what God does is just list a bunch of stuff and say, like, I made all of these different things. I have a purpose for all these different things. I have control over all these different things. And those are things that you just don't get, right? They're things that are beyond your understanding, beyond your ken. So you're just gonna have to trust me. And I think that is a strong argument for skeptical theism, coming from the Judeo-Christian perspective. There are some people that will argue, like, at the beginning of the book, it's kind of weird. At the beginning of the book, you get God and Satan talking, and God's like, hey, check out Job, isn't he awesome? And Satan says, oh yeah, it's just because he has all this good stuff. Let me take away that stuff. God goes, go ahead. And some people say, well, look, it's like God is just sitting up there gambling with our lives. And I don't think that's at all what the case is. I think instead, again, God allows evil things. He allows Satan to be evil in this way because he knows he can bring good things from it and redemptive things from it, right? And then some people will point to the end of the book and say, look, Job got all these things back, right? He got all of his kids. Well, the kids didn't come back. Here's what's interesting. Kids don't come back, right? Some people say, like, he got all his stuff back. Just because he had new kids doesn't mean he got the kids back. You can't replace, your children that you've lost. So I don't think the point is like, if you just, are a super nice guy and just don't argue and don't, get mad with God, then all of these things will be returned to you. In fact, Job was mad at God, and Job was honest with his anger. I think the whole point is really in Job's reaction. Like, you're right, I don't get it. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna trust you with this one. And that, I think, is the point of most of these evils that we don't get, is that, yeah, we might not get them. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to figure them out or shouldn't try to find the redemptive value of them. But I do think in my life, it's been very helpful to be able to say, yeah, I'm not all knowing, I'm not all powerful, I'm not all loving. So I don't really understand why these things are happening, but I'm just going to have to go with it. I'm just trust you just like my son trusts me. Hopefully that wasn't too off topic for all of you guys. But in any case, that is the skeptical theist response to the logical problem of evil, and also a look at what I called the problem of a specific evil. We'll still talk about the evidentialist problem of evil coming up, and also the existentialist problem of evil. So if evil is happening to you right now and you're watching this playlist, like, we're just throwing out a bunch of reasons for why, like, I shouldn't be upset. No, I'm really pissed. Totally understand, right? That's not what this is. This is us considering why might hypothetical evils be happening out there, or just thinking about academically, right? But I think it's a different question when you look at why should I turn to God? Why shouldn't I turn away from God when these bad things are happening? That's what I call the existential problem of evil. We'll look at those going forward, and then we'll get into non-theistic views of evil. And that's all I got for today. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. Adios.